And joining me now from his home in Vancouver is Seth Klein. Welcome to the CJN Daily.
Nice to be with you.
So Seth, we're talking and the confluence of two very timely events. One is Remembrance Day, and one is the end of the COP26 climate talks. How perfect a storm or parallel for your point of view about why there is an emergency in the climate, no?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, if to start with Remembrance Day, which has new meaning for me than it did for much of my life. I mean, just so your listeners know, my book is about mobilizing Canada for the climate emergency, but it is entirely structured around lessons from the Second World War. And as someone who cut their teeth politically in the peace and disarmament movement in the 80s, much to the surprise of myself and many, I wrote a war story, as you did, and it gave me new appreciation for the role of Canada in the war, and new appreciation, not just for what happened on the battlefront, but the book in particular draws on the experience of Canada on the home front and this incredible ramp up of military production to meet that emergency moment as an inspiration for what we now have to do in the face of the climate emergency.
You mentioned it as a climate emergency.
Remembrance
I think
Day
that's one of the key
has
things
new significance to me, and
that is
the stories of a number
of terminology. Words are important. Why do you think the media and politicians should be talking about not climate change or global warming, but the use of the word emergency?
Well, I certainly consciously use the terms emergency and crisis rather than climate change is a technical term, and I mean it describes what's happening, but there's something about it that's a bit sanitized, and doesn't convey the scope of the gravity of the crisis that we face. So I think that language matters. After the summer we've had, there can be no doubt we face an emergency. Here in my province, there was a week in June in which we lost 600 people in a week, mostly lower income isolated seniors. That means it was the most deadly weather event in Canadian history, by the way. And British Columbia lost in that single week about a third as many people as we've lost in the entire pandemic. And we lost the entire town of Lytton, of course. Elsewhere in the country, it was droughts and flooding and wildfires and torrential storms. And this is just a taste of what's to come. This isn't the new normal. It's going to get worse. And even, when we think about the experience we've all had in the pandemic, which was, of course, incredibly disruptive to all of our lives, but as disruptive as the pandemic was, at no time in Canada did it disrupt our food and water systems the way the climate crisis will. And so I think it's right to call it an emergency. And I know, you folks in the media, I know you have a long career in the media, and I know a lot of journalists wrestle with the use of that language, right? They wrestle with the perception that they'll somehow be seen as unobjective or, it has a whiff of advocacy. But there too, there's an interesting lesson from the Second World War, right? I mean, we want our media to be factual and science-based and to tell us the full, not to hide the bad news, not just to be propagandists. But in the face of a civilizational threat, we also want the media to pick a damn side. And the media did in the war, and Canadians would have been appalled if they hadn't. And we're there again.
Now, your book came out as you and many authors have this experience. Is like something happens as soon as you send the book to the printer, and you're like, "Oh my God, it's completely. I have to rewrite the whole ending." It happens to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Your book came out as the pandemic hit,
right?
And there are a lot of things in your book about leadership and about mobilization and retooling of companies, and we let our readers read it. Let our listeners, read the book. But maybe we should fast forward now to today, where that happened.
Yes.
What you wanted to happen happened in the pandemic.
Yes.
So you didn't think it could happen, and then it did. Talk to me a bit about.
Well, yeah. So first of all, just to reiterate, just to reinforce the awkward timing, if you will, as you were getting at, I had literally sent the book off for final copy edit 3 days before the first lockdown. And I, for a little while there, I thought, oh, the whole premise of my book is thrown out the window. I thought we needed an historic reminder, excavated from this 80-year-old story of how quickly we're capable of pivoting and retooling our whole economy. And then boom, here we all are, witnessing just that in real time. But if anything, the book's been out for a year now, and as I give talks about the book and interviews like this, the three are constantly interwoven. The World War II emergency, the pandemic emergency, the climate emergency. There's all kinds of similarities and differences and overlaps and lessons to be drawn. In many respects, our pandemic experience just reinforces the thesis of my book, which is that when leaders actually recognize emergencies for what they are, remarkable things are possible. And the speed and scale of what becomes unleashed can surprise us. And all kinds of rules get thrown out the window, right? Look at the extraordinary public spending that we saw in response to the pandemic. To my mind, that just lays bare kind of the big lie that we've had for years, which is in the face of poverty or homelessness or climate, being told, there's never enough money. Turns out when our governments recognize an emergency as an emergency, the money is always there. Just as it was in the war, just as it was in the pandemic. And as I think we now need to do for the climate emergency, although interestingly, not at the same level as we did the first year of the pandemic. I'd be happy with just, a quarter of that. I would do the job just fine. There's so many parallels now.
The thing is, there are still 10% of the population who's refusing to get vaccinated, anti-vaxxers. Doctors are getting death threats. Doug Ford in our province and some of the other provinces closer out west, the leadership, we don't have to say, but they killed people. People died because of their leadership. So one of the problems is that it has to be a buy-in from, as your book says, all sectors of society, not just
but not unanimous. Right? Not unanimous. This is the other. We need true emergencies to have a full societal mobilization, but it's never going to be unanimous. It wasn't at the outset or during the war. There were always the dissenters, just as in the pandemic, we get the antisocial dissenters who don't seem to give a damn about the well-being of others. And just like we face when it comes to climate, and it doesn't matter. We don't need everybody. When you look at climate, for example, what the polling says is that the people who are out and out climate deniers, deny the science, they're about 7% of the public. It's a diminishing rump of public opinion. That's actually not our biggest problem. I actually believe our far bigger problem is what I call the new climate denialism, which is not those who deny the reality of human-induced climate change, but those leaders who say they get it, and yet who continue to practice a politics and a policy agenda that doesn't align with what the science says we urgently need to do. That's our bigger problem. And that's what we've seen on, just to segue to your other earlier point, that's what we see on display in COP, at the COP meetings, where our leaders consistently get on the stage and say, we get it, and then do not advance an agreement or their own domestic policies that align with what those scientists are telling them.
Okay, let's break down a little bit COP. Canada's, and let me just get my notes, which fell here. I'm really having a bad day today. So, Canada committed to certain things, a hard cap on emissions by oil and gas companies. They are talking about electric vehicles. No, sorry, light duty vehicles in your province, for example. There are other things that are happening with this green agenda. So, evaluate the importance of COP for our listeners. First of all, it got so much publicity, so many people went there, but
Mhm.
you know, is it enough?
Well, so first of all, on your last point, I would say the reporting on COP has been, in the main, quite good. And really, you see the terrain of public opinion shifting. This, I don't want to lose sight of that. We are seeing a change there. The media reporting, what we're getting in COP is really what I would love to see on a more regular basis in terms of media reporting. Tell us every day how this battle for our lives is unfolding at home and abroad, just like you did in the war. The COP story is mixed. There was progress made. At the time you and I are recording this, there's still a day to go. We will see. But before this COP meeting, when you tallied up all the national commitments from the countries, their plans would have resulted in global temperature increase of 2.7 degrees, which is terrifying. Now, after the COP, if you tally it up, it's somewhere between 2 and 2.4 degrees. That's progress. It's also still catastrophic. And so we still have a lot of work to do, pressing all of our governments. And we as Canadians are responsible for our government, and we have to do what we have to do, knowing that millions of other good people of goodwill around the world are having the same conversations with their governments. You asked specifically about Canada's commitment. So I don't know that we heard something new at COP. The Prime Minister went and reiterated some important promises that he made in the recent election. And you named the most significant of those, which is a hard cap on oil and gas sector emissions. That was a promise made in the election.
I'm going to interrupt you. He also said they're not going to give any more money to offshore oil and gas, overseas oil and gas companies, which...
Yes, that was also, that was new, actually. You're right. And that was a win. That was a result of a lot of public pressure, by the way, from a lot of groups who've pushed hard on that. The fine print remains to be seen on it around how they structure it. Is it, is there some wiggle room if something is claimed to be abated, like if there's some carbon capture and storage or whatever? So we will see. And I would point out that the public subsidies for our own domestic fossil fuel activity still far, far outstrips what we finance in other countries, but it was something. But I want to come back to the hard cap on oil and gas. And Trudeau clarified that he means a cap as of now, not that we're going to set some new cap 5 years from now. He means the current emissions will be the cap, and they will decline from here. That is significant, because for the longest time, the federal Liberals would not say that. That was the elephant in the room. They talked a good game on lowering emissions on a bunch of fronts, but they would not name production and the emissions that come from oil and gas, even though that's a quarter of Canada's emissions. And if you actually look at Canada's emissions, it's for the last 20 years, all we've managed to do is plateau. Why is that? In fact, most sectors of the economy and most jurisdictions are lowering their emissions. And all that good work for the last 20 years has been undone by the continued expansion of emissions from the oil and gas sector. So now Trudeau is saying we will cap that. That is significant. But everything will be in the details of the regulatory implementation of that. And we will have to wait and see what that looks like.
Because let's go a little deeper into that. The whole point, it makes you crazy. And I have to say this, and I'm not supposed to put an opinion in it, but, reading your book and also, being aware of what's been going on. How can you, on one hand, you can't have your cake and eat it too with the environment. And this is what the problem is. And your book talks about this dichotomy, right? Sort of a dissonance where, sure, we're going to have lots of these jobs, Alberta, BC, Quebec, Newfoundland, and fossil fuel jobs are our thing, and cars. But then we have to clean up the environment at the same time. And that means stopping taking oil out of the ground right away. No more oil coming out of the ground. And
yes. Well, and you're mentioning,
how do you explain that to our listeners is that can't work?
Well, there is, as you say, an incredible dissonance in it. And in fact, when the government says we're going to have a cap on oil and gas emissions, they just mean a cap on the emissions from the actual extraction and production in Canada. But the thing is, most of what's being extracted is being exported to somewhere else where it will be burned and put up in the atmosphere. But they're not counting that. They're not talking about capping that because that conveniently counts towards somebody else's emissions. And this is again where, Canada, you're absolutely right when you say, once it's had its cake and to eat it too. We conveniently pretend, despite the fact that we are peddlers of this deadly substance, we are the 4th and 6th largest producers of oil and gas in the world. We don't count most of that towards our own emissions. But this is an important piece of COP that happened, coming back to COP, which is the F word got used, by which we mean fossil fuels. 6 years ago, when we got the Paris Agreement, people will find this kind of surprising. The words fossil fuels never appear in the Paris Agreement. The words coal, oil, and gas never appear in the Paris Agreement. It's strictly about cutting emissions, and it likes to pretend that fossil fuels are just some abstract thing, even though they are the source of 80% of the world's emissions. Well, the COP agreement is naming fossil fuels finally. And there's been this whole parallel push for a new treaty, like a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And we saw the launch of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, and Quebec joined that. So all of that matters. That's an improvement.
You said earlier, though, that people are ahead of governments, that there's been this massive support. Even in our last election, you saw climate change was number one, or affordability and climate change. Why do you think this parliament that's coming up starting November the 22nd better listen? Because what's at stake is no longer COVID. We got that, right? This is big, and Canadians care, even though they hardly talked about it during the debates.
Yeah, well, so I interviewed a lot of politicians for my book, and I was only interested in interviewing politicians who I genuinely believe get it. And yet their parties or governments aren't pursuing true climate emergency policies. And I wanted to find out why. And when you interview these folks, invariably, they all fall back on some variant of the line. Well, you got to meet the public where they're at, and the public's not there. Now, I found this a very annoying response because the leaders we best remember from the Second World War didn't meet the public where they're at. They took the public where they needed to go. But I still wanted to test the proposition. So I commissioned my own polling from Abacus data. And I found, as you said, a public that is ahead of our politics, both in seeing and appreciating that we face an emergency and in their willingness to accept truly bold climate policies. That's the good news. But the truth of the matter is the opinion polling is messy and mixed. And one of the problems we face is that the basic level of climate literacy in the country is very poor, kind of appalling, actually, such that only about half of the population correctly understand that the major source of global warming is the combusting of fossil fuels. Now, if that's your starting point, you get these weird results. So you'll say to people, are you really anxious about the climate? Yes. Do you think government should be doing more? Yes. And what should they be doing? And people go right to plastics and recycling instead of what are you burning in your vehicles and in your home, which is the conversation that we actually need to be having.
Well, this is where I want you to come in. We need like a Teresa Tam or a Bonnie Henry, or you guys from the, David Suzuki Project, which you're in charge of.
Climate Emergency Unit.
Right, yeah. Which tells it in simple terms. I mean, now everyone knows every little thing about PCR tests and, R1 on not ones. And everyone's an expert now because it was clearly explained. We had doctors on the social media. It's a different world now than World War II, where there was no social media and communicators. There was, movie theaters and stuff and radio, but it wasn't the same. So what is the role of explaining to get Canadians on board with this lingo and language and the actual
Well, this is exactly what we need. I mean, you're absolutely right that we have all witnessed for the last 2 years, this is what emergency communications is supposed to look and sound and feel like, right? You get daily press briefings, you listen to the health and scientific experts, the messaging is ubiquitous. The media has done its job to inform us on a daily basis of the information we need to know. And what I would say to you and your listeners, when you look at your provincial and federal plans on climate and hear the climate communications, in contrast, is there anything about that looks and sounds and feels like an emergency to you? No. And that's what we need.
Talk to me about if there is this, you said the people are willing and more ahead of the government now, surveys have shown it, but is there a generation or age gap too? That is,
there's definitely higher awareness and higher desire for action the younger you go on the demographics. Interestingly, though, in the polling I've seen and commissioned, there's also regional variation, and it's much as you would expect. With the highest willingness for action is in Quebec, and then sort of my province, and the lowest is in Alberta. But it's not as big a difference as you would think. I mean, even in Alberta, people see the writing on the wall and are much more ready for action than I think we often appreciate when we let Jason Kenney define the political culture of Alberta. It's much more nuanced than that, but it does need to change. So, we talked earlier about the role of the media and the CBC. The CBC played an important role in the Second World War. Thankfully, it had been created 3 years before the war. And Lorne Greene, a nice Jewish boy from Ottawa, who went on to become a great Hollywood star, but began as the CBC newsreader and was affectionately known to Canadians in the war as the voice of doom, right? Everybody listened to him every night to hear the latest. I feel like, on our CBC radio shows today, we probably all listen to across the country with our morning shows that give us this similar hourly business and sports report. If we can have an hourly business and sports report, surely to God, we could have a morning climate emergency report telling us how this is going. And that provides that necessary, that's committed to providing that same daily necessary information the way we've experienced with COVID. And again, I come back to this World War II story. For decades, a lot of the leading climate communicators recommended against using the language I use of emergency and crisis. They said, don't scare people. And a lot of the communication was very individualized. What can you individually do? How do you change your lifestyle? Except that's the thing about climate, like the war. It's an inherently collective endeavor. We don't win it alone. It's why it's a political project. So where was I going with all of this? I just feel like the leaders we best remember from the Second World War didn't shy away from using that emergency language. They were forthright with the public about the severity of the crisis and yet still managed to impart hope. That's the role of communication today.
You dedicated your book to your kids, again, before the pandemic, saying, your love and anxiety motivated it for Zoe and Aaron. A lot of people that age have climate eco-anxiety. It's been almost 2 years now, pandemic, and your writing of your book. How less or more or anxious are you for them as we're speaking today, especially after COP?
Well, first of all, I would say my kids are less anxious because they see their parents working hard on this file, even though they hear climate talk all the time around the table. And I think that's fairly common. And it's true for all of us. That in the end, hope is found in the doing. Right? When you're actually taking action, you feel less anxious. The flip side of that, though, is that any one of us who makes a point of following the climate science feels anxious a lot of the time. I do. And we all walk a razor's edge between hope and despair all the time. There are things that from which we derive hope and things that make us deeply anxious. And the truth of the matter is, and in my book and in my talks, I try to be forthright and not Pollyanna. The truth is, we do not know if we are going to win this fight. We don't know if we are going to do what we need to do in time. But the solace I pull from the World War II story is this, as you wrote about, from a population of about 11 million Canadians, over 1 million of them enlisted, 64% under the age of 21. And what did they not know? They did not know if they would win. Good chunk of those wars, the war's early years, the outcome was far from a foregone conclusion. And yet they did what they had to do anyway. And in the process, they surprised themselves. And that is the spirit I think we need to bring to the climate fight.
This is what our listeners need to know personally. What can they do? What choices should they make? Well,
and people often think, what does it matter what I do personally? And then similar to your husband's question, what often comes up is, what does it matter what Canada does? Because Canada is small. Both I think are these voices that we have in our head all the time. So first of all, I am making the point that in the end, what each of us voluntarily do, if that's what we're relying on, we're fried. That this has to be a collective project, and that the speed and scale of what's now required has to be state-led. And that means that this is an inherently political project. So the most important thing you can do is in fact political. It's to make abundantly clear to all of your political leaders that you want them in emergency mode. And if they're not prepared to be the leaders we need them to be, replace them. But that said, there are important things we can and should do at our household levels. We all need to change how we're getting around, and we all need to fuel swap our homes, particularly at the point of replacement, right? So when you next need a new vehicle, you should not buy a fossil fuel vehicle. When you need to replace your furnace or your hot water heater, don't replace it with gas. That is the time at which you should switch to electric. And that needs to happen urgently, and we need government supports to encourage it. And I want to make this concrete. What we need to do to lower emissions are often the very same things that we need to do to protect ourselves. I opened at the beginning of our discussion by talking about the fact that in my province, we lost just about 600 lower income isolated seniors in June in a week. If those homes had already been fuel swapped, unplugged from gas, replaced with electric heat pump systems, which also cool in the summer, as we urgently need to do to lower the greenhouse gas emissions from our buildings, quite likely every one of those people would still be with us. This is real. This is concrete. This isn't theoretical. And it's going to get worse every summer. So there is, in fact, some urgency to it. And it matters what Canada does. You know, this line that we encounter so often, what does it matter if it's just Canada? But this is one of the things that I love about the World War II story. We didn't wait. We didn't wait on the Americans. They joined 2 years later. We spent a good chunk of those 2 years as the only country in the Western Hemisphere engaged in the fight. We were a much smaller country then, with no established military production capacity at the beginning of the war. And at the end of it, nobody questioned the role and value of Canada's contributions. So we just have to do what we have to do.
The thing is, no more flights to Florida. Stop, buying big RVs and stop, taking cruises. And this is something that hits our listeners. Stop driving to shul. Things like that. Stop wasting.
Well, the driving, I mean, when we say the technical solutions are there, the technical solutions for our buildings are there. The technical solutions for the bulk of how we get around, certainly within our own communities, are there. The one piece that remains challenging is the longer travel, certainly by ship and by plane. And we are going to have to do less of that. Even, there are going to be some technical solutions, but we're going to have to do less of that. That part of our lives is going to change.
It did during the pandemic,
Right.
but they didn't like it. People were sad.
That's
People
right.
were miserable. Bad things happen mentally.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, let me say this. I want to come back to the mental point that you're making. It's true. All the changes and fights have some sacrifice. There are certain things we're going to have to leave behind. I think, you mentioned the point you're making with your husband around people feeling, what's the point if I do this? One of the other lessons out of the pandemic is the importance of mandatory measures, right? Because our governments were too slow imposing a lot of mandatory measures. Again, the public was ahead of our politics, saying, make it mandatory, make it mandatory. Of course, there were the dissenters, the noisy, antisocial rump who didn't want to do it. But in the main, most of us, whether it was the war or COVID or climate, in the main, most of us want to do the right thing. But it irks us because nobody wants to be a chump if we would do the right thing and our neighbor doesn't, right? Which is why people like mandatory measures. You don't have to worry about your neighbors. Your neighbors will do it as well. At the beginning of the war, all of the governments of Canada, the US, the UK were all very nervous that if they were to bring in rationing, they would face like a popular revolt. It didn't happen. It ended up being that rationing was one of the most popular things during the war because it was the piece where everyone felt they were making a contribution and they had the comfort of knowing it was unfolding in a fair way, right? And it was only, when people, you used to get annoyed with, black market stuff that would break the rationing. That's what annoyed people for the same reason.
Profiteering as well.
And the profiteering, particularly in the First World War, which is why the second, the kind of profiteering we've seen in the pandemic was illegal in the Second World War. But you also talked about mental health. And I want to make this point as well. Yes, this has been hard, this pandemic. Health professionals back in London at the beginning of the Second World War thought that the Blitz would be devastating to the mental health of Londoners. And it wasn't. In fact, what they discovered was that in the collective common purpose that people found, they actually became healthier. And interestingly, we've only recently gotten the news that suicides during the pandemic are down by 1/3, right? There is something about being invited to act in common purpose that is healthy for our mental health, I think. But here I want to emphasize one important difference between the pandemic and the climate emergency. The things that we have been called upon to do in this pandemic, isolate, stay home, that's hard. Those things are anathema to all of our social instincts. And people often hear my thesis and they think, oh, look how people tired, the COVID fatigue in less than a year. And now here you are, Seth, asking people to go into emergency mode for a few years. But here's the difference. The things that we're called upon to do for the climate emergency are precisely the opposite. To go out and do something grand together. And I think we can do that for a few years. When we get in that mode, that emergency mode,